transforming developers into security people. And my name is Chris Romeo, and this is actually my third year here at InfoSecCon, so I'm glad to be here. I'm also kind of local here. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Security Journey. And so I've actually been in the world of security for 20 plus years. I've had the opportunity to do all kinds of different cool stuff. Director of Incident Response, application security, trusted product evaluation, lots of different kind of background things. And I think that kind of experience kind of sets up kind of what I've learned and kind of what I'm going to share with you today. I spent 10 years of that time at Cisco Systems, part of their central security team that focuses on building security into all the products that Cisco makes. So a lot of my experience is kind of couched through the eyes of 100,000 person tech company. And then so I've had a chance to speak at a lot of different conferences. I do a podcast called the Application Security Podcast. It's non-commercial, so if you're interested in things application security, you can check that out. I'm also part of the OWASP Triangle chapter, so the Open Web Application Security Project here. Once again, another non-commercial type of avenue, so it's something that you can check out. So what I'm going to describe or kind of go through for you here today is we're going to talk about how to reach developers with security. Traditionally, this has been a challenging problem because, and I'll get into a lot of the details as to why I think that is. But developers are just not natively thinking about security when they're writing code these days. And we can blame it on a lot of different things. You can say, well, you know what, the university system isn't teaching them how to do secure coding. Yes, I agree, but that's not a solution, that's not an answer, that's kind of where we are. But there are some things that we can do to improve this if we understand the problem a little bit better and move forward. So we'll talk about why developers struggle with security. We'll talk about some of the different responses that I've seen throughout my career. And what some of the other people that I know in the industry, I asked the question of them to say, what are the biggest excuses you hear from developers? And I took a whole bunch of different kind of anecdotal feedback. And then we'll talk about how to use what I call security behaviors to help developers along without turning a 50-page process in front of them and dumping all this paper and saying, this is what you have to do. Because if you know developers, you know if you drop 50 pages of paper on their desk, they're going to just push it off into the recycling bin. They're not going to take that and kind of work with it. So if we kind of start at the macro level and we think about kind of the impact of software here. I mean, everybody's probably seen this before in some ways. Does anybody know who this is actually from? Who this quote's from? Famous billionaire guy who created a web browser company. Yeah, it's from Mark Andreessen, who most people don't remember he was the guy behind Netscape. Now he's just a billionaire venture capital person. But it's a fascinating summary of the state of the world that we live in right now. So if you think about all the different software that exists in our world, whether it's from cars, whether it's from web applications, medical devices, power plants, software is in fact everywhere and in everything that we do. Excuse me. So when we start to think about developers now, let's talk about what I call the mindset of the average developer. And so I call this person the average developer because you're going to think of somebody that you know that's a developer and you're going to go, oh, they don't fit these categories. I'm going to argue that that person is not kind of the average person that's out there writing code today. So when you think about the average developer, there's really kind of three things that the average developer will say, hey, you can have 2 out of these 3. The code that you get can either be good, it can be fast, or it can be cheap. Pick 2 out of those 3 things. It's kind of their mindset or the way that they think about it. The average developer is measured against delivery deadlines. When we have a 2-week-long sprint, at the end of this 2 weeks, you've committed to have these user stories done. That's how they're measured. They're measured about what is their kind of bug-free nature. You know, is the code that they create actually bug-free? Excuse me. Is it feature complete? Is it on budget? But the incentive on that average developer is ultimately, we got to ship the code, we got to ship the product, this release has to go out the door. That's the world that they live in, the pressure cooker that is part of their daily life. And so that's what we're up against. This is kind of what's going on inside their brains. I don't know Alexei Shipalev. I don't even know who he is or where he comes from. But I thought this was a really nice quote that kind of summarized the software is eating the world, kind of the solution to this problem of software eating the world. It becomes social responsibility for developers to write correct, maintainable, and understandable code. I wish he would have added secure on the end of that, like comma and secure, but he didn't. But it's still a good representation of what we want the state to be for the code that our developers create. We want it to be correct, maintainable, understandable. If you do all those things, all three of those things, you're already pretty close to secure. If it kind of follows those other kind of principles. So when we start to think about, so what are developers, what are they going to say? Why can't they do security? Why can't they build security into the stuff that they're working on? So the first kind of macro level excuse that we see is security, it's not fast enough. It can't keep up with us. We develop fast, we release fast, what we're doing is moving at an extremely fast pace, and what you're asking me to do is going to slow us down and keep us from being able to be successful. So speed. The second thing I've heard people say is, well, we use methodology X, whether that is waterfall, agile, DevOps, something else that I've never even heard of. They'll say, in DevOps, security is not really possible. And my answer back to them is, well, no, security it can be integrated into any methodology. It doesn't matter what the methodology is. The things that we're going to talk about from an application security perspective fit into all methodologies. And then the last objection that we see, we're kind of guilty as an industry for this. And that is that we are seen as the department of no. If you've been in security for any amount of time, and especially with the folks like developers, if you go up and a lot of organizations that I've seen, when security comes knocking, everybody's like, oh crap. Like they're here to take the fun out of whatever project we're working on. Why is that though? It's because, what do we always say every time we show up to the party? Usually uninvited, sometimes late right before release. What do we tell them? No, you can't do this. This is terrible. This is awful. You should be ashamed of yourself. Right? This is how we communicate with them as developers though. And what do we expect them to do? It's crazy because what I found was, what actually happens? They try to find ways to not contact us. They say, well, last time security came in, they kind of stopped what we were doing that was really cool. So we're just not going to contact them this time. We'll just take our chances. And so this is the mindset that we're up against, and we got to think differently. We got to act differently to be able to connect with these developers. So here's another great one that I always chuckle at. I'll be talking to a developer, and they say, security is really not my problem. Right? We have the security department. They sit over there. They wear dark clothes and black T-shirts all the time. They don't talk to anyone else. They're clandestine type of people. They do security. I don't have to do security. Well, BSIM, this is from BSIM 7. They just released BSIM 8, so I can't imagine this number got any better. What BSIM found in their analysis of their 80-some companies that actually take software security very seriously enough to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to be assessed against this standard is that for every 100 developers, there's 1.61 security people. So the idea that this is security's problem doesn't work. It doesn't fit into this idea. We have to get to the point where the developers themselves have an understanding about what's expected for them from a security perspective. How can they be successful there? And we have to give them the tools, the technology, the process, the knowledge to be successful. We can't just lean on this idea that, we have a security department. That's good. So here's what I find when I think about developers relatively kind of in general. So the first thing is that, coming back to that average developer, security is a stretch for what they're doing. They have a lack of understanding even of, or awareness of even what security means. And I've had situations in the past where I go in and you start talking to a team and they'll kind of people be like nodding their head and you're using, we have all these words we use in security like vulnerability and risk and threat and zero-day exploits and backdoors, and we got a million of them. And that people will be just nodding their heads, and then I started to realize after a while that a lot of times they don't even know what we're talking about. They just don't want to have that conversation about what the basics are. So that speaks to kind of why security is a stretch. Also to this idea of security IQ. I think of security IQ as how knowledgeable is this developer about security? When we say OWASP top 10, do they even know what that is? If they're a web programmer, hopefully they've at least heard of the OWASP top 10. If not, I don't really they need to tell me what application they're working on so I can make sure my stuff's not going into it, because that information may be quickly coming out and going to somebody else. But do they even have that security IQ? And then developers are the first line of defense. We always think about like InfoSec and networks and things. We think about all these protections that we have out there. But when you're thinking about application security, a lot of times application security, what's happening there is resulting in applications that are being deployed on web servers that are becoming what your product offerings are. If you're a bank, you have one of your most prized assets, other than the money in the vault, is your web interface that allows your customers to interact with what you're doing there. That is the product that comes out of what your developers are working on. And your developers are ultimately the first line of defense. If that web interface has large security problems, then that causes ripples through your entire business if you're a bank. So one of the other things I find is that developers are not monsters. And what I mean by that is the developer is not sitting there in their cube going, I'm going to show the security people now, watch this. SQL injection, now placed in there, commit the code, yeah. They're not maliciously saying, I'm going to mess all these things up and try and generate problems. What I find is that 99 times out of 100, they just don't know. Sure, is there a bad apple somewhere in an organization? Of course, there's always going to be those people that are trying to do bad stuff. But most of the developers, they don't even know what the right thing is that we expect them to do. And developers are known to sometimes be stubborn as well, so that can play into this. But we're asking them to do something that we haven't even made them aware about. And that's part of where the challenge comes in. And that's where the frustration comes in on their side too. Because we haven't even told them what we want them to do, but yet we're holding them against that standard. So here's my goal when I start working with any new group of developers. I want to get to the point where I have developers that think like security people. Okay, the developers that think like hackers, that's kind of a soapbox for me. I don't like the idea that, I think it's impossible to teach developers to think like hackers, because hackers or attackers, however you want to call the people that are doing bad stuff on the internet, they've already made a moral decision to use their skills for evil and not good. I don't really need developers that do that. I want developers that think more like security people than they do actually attackers. And so when I think about what does it mean to have a security person mindset, well, that begins with the foundational knowledge we talked about. A web programmer, the foundational knowledge should include the OWASP top 10, as an example. You should really just live and breathe that if you're operating in the web space. The second piece that I think plays into that security person mindset is understanding the attacks themselves. It's one thing to say you have to know the OWASP top 10, but does that developer actually know how a SQL injection attack works? Can they actually see when their web form is placed up there and someone puts in data, they put in SQL commands, it gets passed through? Do they understand what actually happens when a SQL injection attack hits their application and that command gets passed all the way into the SQL interpreter and then processed, and then the data gets exfiltrated back out through their application space? Do they understand it at that level of knowledge? The third thing is acknowledging attacks. It's one thing to know about all the steps that go into them, but we really need developers that can say, okay, I admit my application is going to be attacked. Because I've spoken to developers before, and I've heard this excuse where they'll say, well, this application that I've worked on, it's just not that interesting. Nobody would ever try to attack this. Why would they? It doesn't have any interest. There's no personally identifiable information that they could access or anything. And what they don't realize, though, is that attackers will use any interface they have available, and then they'll look to move laterally to somewhere else. And if they can get one step closer to the prize by going through an application that seems like it has limited value, they will do that, and they will try to use that to their advantage. Fourth piece of this is utilizing tools and processes. And so you do have to have some understanding of what are the steps that you go through to build a secure product. What are some of the tools that you have to do to help enable you along the way? It doesn't have to be just understanding secure coding principles and trying to apply those by yourself in isolation. There are things like static analysis tools and dynamic analysis tools that can assist the developer in grasping onto this security person mindset. So one of the things that I think is important when we're going to start talking about how we're going to actually educate these developers to do this. I don't know if anybody's read this book before. It's completely outside of our discipline here. It has nothing to do with security, which I try to read about half of the books I read. I try to get away from the security world because there's just so much more to learn out there. Simon Sinek wrote this book called Start With Why. And the premise of this book is that, and if we do this kind of from a security perspective, when we go in to teach somebody something, we first start with the what. So with the developers, we go in and we say, okay, security is very important to us, and because of that, we have this secure development lifecycle. Here's all the steps you have to go through, and we dump all the things we want them to do right at the beginning. And they don't have any idea what are we really asking them to do. And then if we were to move into the how, which is traditionally how we would approach this, that means we're going to maybe give them some additional guidance on how they should do secure coding or things. But the challenge we have here is we haven't actually told them from the beginning, why do you even care about this? And I think this is, I've seen this problem in much of the kind of security education space right now. Everybody has all these training modules that tell you about the OWASP top 10, but nobody stops and says, here's why you care about a SQL injection. Here's what can happen as a result of one, and here's the ramifications to personally identifiable information that your application stores. This is going to have a negative impact on your family members who use this application through our bank, through all of our customers. We never stop and we never expose the developer to why they need to care. And when you expose somebody to why, it changes the game for them. They see things differently now that they understand why they actually need to care. What's the motivation? So if you want to try to do this with a large population of developers, which when I did this at Cisco, our developer population was about 25,000. I don't know, 23,000 relatively easygoing people and 2,000 very difficult people, probably would be how it would break down in that community. But just like everything, a bell curve can certainly be applied to this idea of trying to change security culture within an organization. And so when you think about trying to instill this idea of developers caring about security, you start with the security people who are already engaged. These are the developers and there's a population in every company, whether you have 10 developers or 25,000, there's at least one person out of that 10 who has some type of knowledge of security or understanding or passion. So that's kind of the security people. Those are the people you got to get to buy in very early on, because you need them as an advocate to help you push this mission forward. Because I've yet to see a security program that was so over-resourced that they were like, we just could not use the help of any of the development staff. We have so many people, we've got 100 people in our group here, they got nothing to do, they're just sitting here taking up space. No, everybody is like the 1.61 to 100, and probably if we did a calculation based on the folks in this room, it's probably less. That 1.61 is based on BSIM, people who spend a lot of money on software security, that's their number. So as an average across the industry, it's probably less than that too, so we need their help. But once we go from the security people, then we've got the security interested. These are the people who have they've heard of security before, maybe they're a little bit interested in it. Then we kind of make our way into the early majority, and then we get to the early majority are the people that are following along. They're kind of the followers in the organization, and then we get to the difficult people. And that's where we have the forced compliance group. These are the people that we just have to write a policy that says you're going to do application security and you're going to smile about it, is what we're going to have to write on the policy. And so there's a population of them. And then in every organization, there's that last group, that red, that's never going to do it anyway, whether you write the policy or whatever. And so I like to go in knowing that. Like, knowing that I'm never going to get to 100%. Like, I'm not going to measure my success on 100% adoption of anything. Because there's always one person who's going to say, they may think it's the best idea in the world, but they just don't agree with anything. So they're going to push back. So really, when we think about it, application security, this is a people problem. This is a human resources problem as we interact with the developers. And they are the key here. Tool vendors get real mad when I put something like this up and say, well, no, our technology and our tools are the overall solution and be-all, end-all for an application security program. The tools are only as good as the people that drive the tools. I've seen so many organizations that do something like static analysis where they have tools that look at all of their code. And you know what they do with the results? Nothing. They pile them up off to the side. Because they can say we do static analysis, but there's no process for developers to actually triage any of the things that come out of that. So I don't hate tools. I think they're very useful, but I think people have to drive those tools. I think that's part of our success. Okay, so here's the 4 different groups that I found as I looked at kind of my experiences and asked a number of different people that I know from big companies and small that run application security departments. I said, what are the excuses or responses that you have for why people don't approach application security as developers in your organization? And so we start with the unfamiliar group, then there's overworked, apathetic, those that really just don't care. And then there's always that small percentage of the gung-ho people that have already bought into this idea of doing AppSec. So let's start with our first group, the unfamiliar. I call them the unfamiliar / uneducated. And I don't mean that as a negative perspective. I'm not saying they're uneducated as people in general. I just mean that they haven't been taught about application security and the role of the developer in that space. That first one's actually a direct quote from a friend of mine who I won't say the company that he got it from. He sent that to me and he goes, here, you're not going to believe this. This was just somebody who told me the other day. Why? That's actually what the person said to him. Why? Like legit, why do we need to do security? So that's a case of somebody who just it hadn't been explained to them. What are the threats? What are the risks? What are the things that could happen negatively to the application that you're working on? There's the don't understand it. There's number 3, just makes me shudder. We're small, no one would go after us. Of course, no one would go after anybody on the internet. And then number 4 is another live one there too. Security causes change, and change is too risky for our apps. I really wish I knew which company that was in case I'm a customer of theirs. Because if change is too risky, then and security is going to cause too much risk to their development process, then they got bigger problems. So one of the first action that we can use, how do we counter this kind of unfamiliar perspective? Here's really 6 things that I try to break down with development teams to say, if I only have a limited amount of time, what are the things that I can connect with this audience to get the word across here? And it starts with security fundamentals. Just a basic breakdown like of the things I mentioned a little bit earlier. Risk, threat, vulnerability, exploit, 0-day, backdoor, all of these things. And let's just level set what those things mean across the entire developer population. Sure, some of the people in that population know what those things are, but not everybody does, and they don't all understand the same definitions. Attacks and attackers. So I like to paint a kind of a high-level picture of what are the types of attacks that they're going to be dealing with, and who are the people behind them. I like to put kind of at least a profile-based perspective where, and what I mean by that is I'm going to describe what does it mean to have a cyber criminal attack your application, a nation state, an insider, trusted insider, hacktivist. I'm going to give them some kind of profile perspective so that they start to think about when I'm making this decision for security about what I'm going to do, there are real people out there that are coming after us. They need to understand the process. I love to do something that I focus in on security myths because there's so many myths out there about security and there's the classic ones like, we have a firewall, we're protected. I think we're past those for the most part in most organizations. But there's a lot of other myths. I hear developers say, well, we have, our application has SSL, TLS, so we're good. We don't need to do anything else. Like, no. You got a lot more that you need. I mean, it's good that you do SSL TLS. You're protecting the confidentiality of the data between the browser and the server. I love that. That's great. But there's also a whole lot more that you have to do. So that's the idea of myths. Privacy is a huge thing. I mean, GDPR, all you got to do is say GDPR these days, right? I mean, I don't know if everybody's familiar with this EU kind of data privacy thing, but what should scare the heck out of everybody is 4% of gross revenue is the maximum penalty. If you're a $100 billion company per year, 4% of gross revenue is a lot of money. So that's going to drive a lot of. But so I mean, and that's the type of lesson that I would put out in front of developers. They don't have to know what GDPR is. They don't have to be able to give a book report on it or whatever. But they should at least know that 30-second snippet of we care about privacy because 4% of what we make per year is a lot of money, and we don't want to give that to the EU government as a result of something bad we did in an application choice. So the other thing here is everyone's a security person. So this is kind of a mindset that I want to instill across the entire population of developers. Coming back to that idea that getting them to think like a security person, I want to get to the point where everybody thinks, you know what, this security thing, maybe I own just a small little piece of it, but I own part of this problem and I own part of this solution. Because we don't want them to be thinking, hey, there's somebody else out there that's going to save the day for me. Okay, here's our second group. I mean, this is kind of expected. This is the overworked group. They say, hey, I just have too much other work to do. Management doesn't provide time for security. Security is an unfunded mandate. We don't have to build security. Yeah.
Security's not in my contract. You didn't tell me I had to build secure code.
That's a good point. No, that's
and by the way, if you want me to fix it, that's going to cost you this much.
Yeah, a lot of companies are now very specific in their contracts that I've seen about what's expected from a secure coding perspective. Even now, it gets even crazier than that. Some customers now I've seen are actually writing into the contract, a purchase agreement, that the company they're purchasing from has to actually follow their own secure development lifecycle process. This customer is writing into their purchase contract. I mean, it's like, you know, you're basically telling them we're forcing you to follow your own best practice, but that's what they have to do to ensure they get the products that they want. So we don't have time to build in security. That's the other thing from the overwork perspective. So how do we counter this idea of overwork? So automation in the developer's world is really how we need to connect with them from the overworked perspective. And so what I mean by automation is, in the world of application security, I've been talking about this static analysis thing that's going to go through and check the code. There's two different things we can do from an automation perspective to make static analysis easier. One thing we can do is we can integrate static analysis into the developer's IDE, their development environment. And the cool thing about that type of static analysis is their secure code checking then works like a spell checker would in our word processor. So they're coding along, and if it detects a problem, it'll bing, it'll stop them in real time and have them go back and fix that problem right there, versus committing their code, waiting 2 weeks for some type of report to come, and they've already forgotten where they were and what they did. The other way we approach automation from a static analysis perspective is a pretty standard process in the world of anybody doing anything tech related is to have a nightly build. You always have an automated process that builds your software at least once a day to ensure that it's not completely hosed up based on lots of different people committing code and things over time. So you can also set up your static analysis to run automatically against that nightly build every day. Every time after the nightly build runs, have it call the static analysis. Now, we say simplify as well. Here's another challenge with something like static analysis. What most companies do is they'll buy a shiny new static analysis tool, and they'll be like, this thing is the coolest. We spent $27 million for this thing. We're going to get our money's worth. Turn on everything it can do. Give me all 472 checks, all enabled. And now scan it, run the scanner against this code. What happens?
70,000 faults.
You get a stack of paper this big if you print out the report. And what does the developer do with that? There's nothing, I can't even make a dent in that. And they just walk away. Hopefully they recycle it, but they don't. So when I say simplify from that perspective, here's a crazy idea. take that $27 million tool you just got, run some preliminary scans against the code bases, figure out what the one thing is that thing is really solidly erroring on for one type of problem. When you enable the policy, turn on that one checker. What happens, the developer gets a report, has 5 entries in it. It's hard to be overwhelmed by 5 entries in a report file. 70,000, it's very hard to not see how you could survive that. So it comes down to automating and simplifying. Another thing that we can think about here is what is our management and our executive support of this idea of doing software security? And I mean, in my career, I've always been kind of a bottom-up type of perspective. I always like to work at the grassroots level and then kind of force management's hand later in the process because they have no choice but to kind of jump in line with whatever the ideas that we were working towards, whether it was improving security or whatever. But I think there is value. It's going to be really tough to find an executive these days who's going to say, you know, security is just not a priority here. At least they're not going to say it in public. They might say it in closed doors, but you know, where there was no possible chance of anybody else hearing it. But and if you have folks that still have that kind of perspective, all you got to do is take them in front of a customer and let the customer ask the customer about what is your perspective on security. It's going to be a pretty automatic answer from the customer. All right, so let's look at another category here. This is the apathetic / complacent / I even put in know-it-all in there. So this is the person who says, it's too hard. That sounds really complicated. I don't think I can pull this off. Someone else's responsibility with nothing worth protecting. We've always done things this way. Don't you love that when you hear somebody say that? We've always done things this way. Ugh, really? And then the best one, I already know all this stuff. Well, if you knew all this stuff, you wouldn't have any vulnerabilities in your code, but so maybe you don't actually know all this stuff along the way. So how do I counter this one? I'm not afraid to use a little bit of shock value if I've got somebody who really wants to be combative about kind of where we are from a security perspective. Anybody know what the stats are behind this? You know what incident this is in response to or a description of? Kind of an AppSec incident from a couple years ago. Anybody recognize it?
Target?
Okay, not Target. What was? So it's Mossack Fonseca, a law firm in the Caribbean.
Oh, yeah.
11.5 million documents, 200,000 basic contracts and things, 2.6 terabytes of data, all because of an unpatched Joomla SQL injection vulnerability in their crappy primary front-end kind of website.
And a bunch of money laundering trails.
Yes, and a couple of politicians lost their jobs because they were clients of this law firm and they had all these shell companies and things. So that's neither here nor there. But if I was going into a law firm and they were saying, we don't really care about application security, this is the case study I'd throw in front. Oh, really? I bet you these guys didn't either. Look, shock value, right? I mean, we're not supposed to use fear, uncertainty, and doubt. At least that's what they say. But you know what? In small amounts, it's okay to still use. I wouldn't use it as my primary campaign to reach developers. Like, let's see if we can scare everybody to death. But you know, there are certain people who want to be difficult and combative, and I'm not afraid to use history. Another thing you can do from this is if you work in a big company, you can look across your history and find juicy vulnerabilities that have happened in the past and bring those out and say, when someone says, oh, I don't think that could happen to us. Oh, no, here, look at this bug. Look this up in the bug tracking system. See the fact that this actually happened before. Can't believe I put this in here. I almost want to skip to the next slide. I'm kind of like an anti-compliance person, but there is with this group of people, the apathetic, the people who are say, I just don't care, compliance is going to be one of the ways that we have to get a hold of them and say, okay, you know, here's something that you actually have to do something with. So, you know, it's going to be mandatory. And I think compliance from this perspective, I mean, we may have laws, rules, standards, or things that are driving us. So what do we do when we have the gung-ho population? These are the people that are saying, hey, where do we learn more about this security thing? Well, that's a dream answer when you're talking to a group of developers, like, oh, you want to learn more? Great, let me help you. Is there somebody that can mentor me? I've seen number 3 happen a number of times in my days at Cisco where we would have a developer that was really passionate about security as a developer, and then they would basically transition and make a whole career switch into becoming a security person. Because security people with a development background are really hard to find, like a solid development background. And so they are able to, because they speak and they know the ways of the developer intrinsically, and then they add the application security on top of that, and it's just a great combination for people. So to connect with those people, one of the things that I like to do and to encourage those people is this idea of security community. So how do we connect with these people? Different companies will call it security advocates, security guilds, security champions. It's building an internal community where these developers that love security can come together and encourage each other. They can train, they can learn all kinds of new things. And you can do this with monthly training sessions. You can do security days. You can do a capture the flag event for a group of developers where you set up a vulnerable web application and you say, everybody come on in this room and try and see which vulnerabilities you can find in this web application. And you can even get to the point where you're doing your own kind of developer-focused conference. When you get to it, you have to be at a certain level of maturity to pull that off, though. You don't do that on day one. But all the other three you can actually do from a day one kind of perspective. Okay, so informal poll of the audience here. Who would say, think about the developers in your organization. Who would say that you encounter unfamiliar as the most likely? Okay, couple hands go up. How about gung-ho? Okay, awesome. How about the apathetic, we could care less? Okay, good mix there. And then the biggest category, overworked. Yeah, it's always, I've done this talk a couple times. That one always wins. So that's the biggest problem that we're dealing with, though, and it helps us to keep that perspective when we're making these plans for how we're going to interface with the developers. Okay, so I like to think about this idea of a security behavior. So what I don't want to do is write a whole bunch of process documents, because developers really don't like process documents. And it's not a way to connect with them where they are. So when I'm talking about a security behavior, this is going to be something, first of all, it's going to be lightweight. It's going to be something they can do and do quickly and get a result from it. It's going to be well-defined. It's going to have a clear understanding of why the heck they need to do it and what is the return on investment for them, from their world. Not for the business, not for the team, from their perspective. And it'll have clear start and finish points, and it has to be easily repeatable. So it's not a process. It's not a number of steps. It is how do we transition into something that developers can actually connect to. So when I think about how do we actually do this, the end goal is I want to get to the point where we have security habits for our developers. And what I mean by that is when a developer truly has a security habit, they're just doing security. It just becomes part of how they write code, how they build products, how they make decisions. If we get to the point where those developers are thinking security in everything that they do, that's the real end game here. But to do that, we have to start with these behaviors where we kind of set up for them some things they can do, follow a bit of a pattern, with the hope that if they do that pattern enough times, it'll eventually become part of how they build product for us or build applications. So it starts with learning. That's probably not a huge stretch. We want to get those fundamentals. We want to help them to have the correct level of education based on what they need from an awareness perspective of their world. Second thing is what I call experience. So it's security experience. There's a couple of different companies now that make these environments where developers can actually test security vulnerabilities in a kind of sample application and learn at the same time. And so what happens is they'll come into a discussion of SQL injection, and they'll have a fake web application running in the browser, and then a series of steps that kind of guides them through, here's how you actually exploit a SQL injection. And so the idea here is if we get developers are hands-on people. I mean, they write code for a living, so they want to get their hands on the keyboard. If you put developers in an 8-hour lecture-based secure coding class, they'll get to the end of the day, and what did everybody learn? Nothing. Because that's not how they have to put hands on the keyboard and experience this thing as they go. OWASP has a project called WebGoat, which is a vulnerable web app that fits into this category. OWASP has another project called Juice Shop. The thing I love about OWASP is everything's open source, so you never wonder what the cost of anything is. And then Code Bashing and Secure Code Warrior are two other companies. I don't have any interest in them or anything. I just have seen their stuff, and I like what they're doing from this experience perspective. So we already talked about community quite a bit, and you know, it's how do we connect people together? How do we build a network of security-focused developers across the organization? Another lesson, another behavior we have to build in here is this from the manager's perspective. Managers really have to have a perspective on the resource needs for security. And whatever, I mean, that's going to look different in every organization. I can't give you a formula that says, well, for every 2-week sprint, you need 8 hours of security time per developer. I mean, it's going to be dependent on what happens in your process, how refined your process with automation and tools and everything is built up. Do you have no process and it's just kind of like we're trying to do one thing? But the point is, managers need to understand. You should never have a manager that says, well, you know, we don't have time for that. That's like a worst case scenario for me, is to have a manager that would answer in that way. And so we have to build that behavior where the managers just know, you know what, we just build security in. We have a multiplier that says we have to invest this much in every given sprint. Whether that means we knock off one user story from a sprint, whatever it is, find the right metric. Okay, another potential idea here is this thing called threat modeling. How many people are familiar with threat modeling? Okay, good population of this group. For those that haven't heard, very simply, threat modeling is looking at a design, hopefully prior to writing code, to identify any security problems in that design and fixing them in advance of the coding phase. I like to say that if I could only do one application security kind of activity or behavior in any organization, threat modeling would always be if I only had one, this would be the one I go to all the time. Because I just see so many developers and when I teach threat modeling, I spend about 5 minutes talking about what threat modeling is, and then we go to the whiteboard and we start threat modeling something that they work on. Because I've seen so many developers that will begin the process going, this is stupid, and then all of a sudden they'll be looking at the whiteboard and I'm asking questions about, well, what about this? What about the communication between these two? And all of a sudden that light bulb goes, ding, goes on over their head, and they're like, oh, wow, okay, now. So there's just so much opportunity for developers to kind of get it in that threat modeling process. Code review, this is a hard one. I mean, I think it's a behavior that we need. Secure code review is a behavior that we need developers to understand, but it takes a certain level of experience, a certain level of knowledge. This is not something you're going to do in day one of trying to connect with your developers. This is something that's in a year 2, year 3 kind of perspective, after you've got some people that have that knowledge that can really do the secure code review well. Red teaming, so everybody knows red teaming, but I like to think about red teaming from a security behavior for the developer. How can we teach the developers just a tiny little bit about pen testing? Because the idea here is I want developers that are actually trying to attack the things that they write. I want them to actually run a SQL map style tool to see if there's any SQL injection in there. I don't want them to think like attackers or whatever, but I want them to have at least enough understanding to be able to attack the things that they create, just in a small amount. I don't need them to be full-time pen testers. But what that does is it just changes perspectives again. And then response. So that's a behavior. And what I'm trying to build in the security behavior for response is I just want developers to know that to be able to notice and say, ooh, this is a problem that I need the response team to help with. I don't need them to fix it. I don't need them to be the one that communicates to the world. I just need them to go, oh, got to contact our PCERT team, our product security incident response team. They need help. They need to be notified about the fact that this just happened, that I found this problem in the code as I was doing my code review. The static analysis tools identified this particular challenge. So it's just about kind of connecting them with the response side. So when you think about, this is just kind of a slide that summarizes everything that I've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so. The 4 different responses, I categorize them into the different transforms that can help us to enable these different behaviors, whether it's learning, experience, community, resources, threat modeling, code review, red teaming, and ultimately our response. So if you wanted to do something with this, I always like to leave people, like if you're like thinking, hey, maybe I'd like to try and do something with what he just talked about here, here would be what I would recommend. So first thing you got to do is understand what is the security culture that exists in your organization. Okay? Every organization has a security culture. Doesn't matter who you are. Everybody has one. Some of them are really good. Some of them are really terrible. But you have to know where you're starting from as a place to get going. And then ask your developers. Start to double check with the developers about what your thinking is here, about what your conclusion was. One of the things I love to do when I get called in to do an assessment for a company, they'll say, hey, come in and take a look at how our application security processes and things are. I'm like, okay. I'll go into the meeting and they'll be telling me the story. Okay, we do all these things and it's great. And I'll be like, oh, that's great. Can I go get a drink of water? And I'm like, oh, sure. The break room's right down there. I walk down the break room. I see who's in there. I'm like, hey, what do you do here? They're like, oh, I'm a developer. Oh, hey, tell me what you guys do for security. The stories never match up exactly. So that's why it's good to kind of circle around and kind of get some perspective on that. And then, you know what? You got to look at those different behaviors and say, okay, I can't do all of these things at the same time. Where do I start? Pick the one that's got the best chance of success is what I would do. Your organization, once you get done with that kind of assessment, you can say, okay, threat modeling is something I think we could really have an impact with. I think our developers would really grab onto it, would fit into our design review process that we already have well. That's what I would go. Start with one. And then when you get to the 6-month mark, see how many more you can add into it. And then, within a year, see if you can roll out kind of everything across the way. If it takes you 2 years, so what? Security culture change, this is a long haul type of game. This is not something that it's like, in 2 months, we're going to have this thing fixed. This is a multi-year experience. And so, it's just know that most of the developers that we're working with, this AppSec thing is new to them. They don't understand what we're even talking about. There's lots of excuses out there, but I don't know that any of those are really valid at the end of the day when I'm staring across the table from the customer who's saying, my data is important to me. All those excuses tend to kind of break apart and really not be that interesting anymore. And then it's about behavior. It's not about process. It's not about a 50-page document. It's about how do we change the behaviors and get those to kind of morph into the habits where people just start to threat model when they look at a picture. Anytime they see a network diagram, they start to threat model and pull it apart. All right, so with that, I am done with my prepared time. I would love to take any questions anybody might have.